Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fight podcast. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, and Swith and Dobson. Today we are doing a second look at predictions we made last year on the last roundtable and last episode of last year, right before Christmas break. And a lot has happened in 2022. War in Ukraine, escalations with tensions with China and Taiwan, and increasing supply chain shortages. So I took some notes on this. So, terminal philosophy, you made some predictions. You said that the government will manage COVID much the same as it has thus far, and that more strains of corona might develop. Well, this year isn't over, so it is possible that. So, for example, coronavirus came out in the winter, right? It was December 2019. So, if there is any more of this prediction hasn't yet been proven to have not come true. We're not over with 2022 yet. The civil religion of COVID will wax and wane depending on the actual COVID status. Hopes there won't be any more shutdowns. Things won't go back to normal until 2024, 2025. And I'm guessing you meant back to normal in terms of COVID. Though with war brewing, normal may be further away. You said for global predictions in a multipolar world, Turkey would exercise more soft power. I think that's largely been correct. We've seen Turkey influence Syria. We've seen Turkey help broker the grain deal with Ukraine and Russia to help get grain out of Odessa. So that's, of course, that whole region in the Black Sea is those three countries share coastal regions there. And then you said Taiwan and Cyprus and Central Asia might turn into zones of conflict. Taiwan already looks like it's shaping up to be a zone of conflict. I also heard on RT that there's a conflict brewing between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, that they're going to have like some sort of like intervention with China and Iran over, and India. And then you said the U.S. woke side will get louder. I don't know if it's louder than it has last year. And then you said that the woke religion gets more involved in the lives of Americans. We might see more of a reaction against it. And I think to some extent we have. It's not being reported as much anymore, but I mean, before the social media outlets just stopped reporting on negative things. I remember hearing that a lot of like center-left liberal types were getting upset about Drag Queen Story Hour and what they were teaching their kids in school. So, Swithin, the predictions I got from you were there's zero reason to rule out the elite to end coronavirus and declare victory. Well, again, Biden did that 4 days ago, so that's interesting. Lockdown restrictions are a policy in search of a justification. Yes, I do believe with that. You said that. And the next few years, you might get more right-wing terrorism. I don't think we've seen any of that yet, other than, the eponymous Jan 6. But that was already in the past even then. Lockdowns cause people to reduce faith in the police. Well, you see, what's interesting with war brewing now, it looks like I would actually argue the wokeness is being held on a shorter leash because you've got to get basically straight white men to sign up for the army again. And right now you have, all-time low recruitment levels across all the services in the United States. So I think we might see what we are beginning to see is the tamping down. It's not going away, but it's just not as much as in your face. And then Keith, you made predictions about Roe v. Wade, which has since been repealed. And you said it will escalate to culture war. I expected to see more violence after that. I think what people are waiting for is the November midterms. I remember Nancy Pelosi said, we're going to overturn all this in November. So I think a lot of people are waiting for November before they really, freak out. You also predicted, Keith, sanctuary cities for everything. U.S. elites are more like European elites. They identify with their own class than other elites. Yes. And then America's fragmenting more like Yugoslavia and South America. And then you said, the only thing I said was that the Bretton Woods global order is over. And I still think that's more or less true. Supply chain shortages are only getting worse. So, we'll start with you, Keith. What are some of your thoughts on the predictions that we all made?
Well, I think I got it right about the Roe v. Wade thing. I do think that has really become a major issue now that the Roe v. Wade was repealed. It's true there really hasn't been that much violence. There's been some violence associated with that. There've been attacks on what are these places? Not an abortion clinic, but the opposite of that, where it's like they try to dissuade you.
Crisis pregnancy center.
Yeah, there've been attacks on those. there were threats against Supreme Court justices. Like you had one guy that was arrested for a near assassination attempt of one of the Supreme Court justices. So there has been some violence, but no, it hasn't been like mass rioting or anything like that. Um, I think in part that's what you're saying is right, that the people are maybe waiting to see what happens with the midterms. But I do think this has escalated the culture war to a new level. I think increasingly more and more people view the culture war. I mean, the people who are really absorbed in that, they view it as an existential battle. In fact, we don't seem to hear quite as much about woke like we used to. And I think one reason why is that it has been overshadowed by the abortion thing. Like that's like the new front. It's like drag queen story hour. It's not, all that still goes on, but that was that was the last battle. And while it's still going on, now we've moved on to a new front or something like that. Um, Violence. We haven't had political violence this year so far, like the street fights between the left and right, like Charlottesville and Berkeley and some of those places, like we had in the past. But we have had lone wolf incidents. Like there was a guy in Buffalo, New York, that a white supremacist that went and shot a bunch of black people in a supermarket, and there was some guy who drove a car into a barricade outside the Capitol and then killed himself. I don't know what he thought he was doing. He thought of himself as a suicide bomber or something. There was somebody that tried to attack a FBI office. I think that was in Ohio or something. So we have seen more lone. Oh, then there's the guy that ran a bunch of people down in a parade. I think it turned out he was a black supremacist or something. So we have seen more individuals acting violently. We haven't seen the collective violence that we saw in the past. So I think that's interesting. And internationally, I think that I mentioned that the American elites increasingly identify with international elites and not any one country. I think we've definitely seen that with Ukraine. Ukraine is basically has been an expression of solidarity among the Western ruling classes. It's and you because I mean, it's funny how you see the Ukraine. I stand with Ukraine everywhere. I mean, you don't ever hear that about Yemen. You don't ever hear that about Palestine. You don't ever hear that about Armenia, even or even Taiwan. Really, I mean, you don't hear about Taiwan much outside of Fox News or other venues where China's considered a primary enemy. It's more about Ukraine, and Putin's a bad guy because he's a fascist or whatever. So I think those things are all coming into being. The abortion escalating, the culture war, violence, political violence, and then the increased international alienation of ruling classes from the populations they govern. Those seem to be all unfolding.
Okay, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I think it's pretty clear that the majority of my predictions never materialized. It seems that Swithin and I more or less ended up making the same failed prediction that COVID would continue. I think my specific prediction was that COVID would continue into 2024 or 25. But as we know, our fearless leader, Joe Biden, declared it over. So it would seem that I got that wrong. But another one that I got wrong was that there will be new strains of COVID-19. And again, this was kind of more born out of pessimism and just kind of being black-pilled about the whole situation. I suppose there was the sort of quick mention in the media of monkeypox, so maybe I didn't get that 100% wrong, but we can hash that out later. And then I also got the prediction wrong that there won't be more lockdowns. Of course, I was wrong about that because China escalated its lockdown status quite a bit. There was a few temporary lockdowns in Australia, and in select urban areas in Germany, there was lockdowns as well as a few areas in the United States. So I got that wrong. As far as the ones that I got correct for the most part was that Turkey would start exercising more soft power. This was just more based off of just some reading of sort of some of the trends in Turkey's trade relationships. And although Erdogan and Putin are publicly not in the best, they're not in the best standing with each other, there are actually there have been more trade relationships forged between Turkey and Russia. So that's been sort of an interesting development. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, I think Turkey is trying to reemerge as sort of an Ottoman Empire regional power 2.0. And I think they're slowly sort of working on that with sort of a complicated relationship between the United States, the European Union, and Russia. So we'll have to see how they manage that over the next few years. And then the sort of civic religion of the Church of Woke being louder, also with a corresponding reaction from that. I think I was sort of kind of halfway wrong, halfway right on that, in the sense that, I mean, what Keith said earlier, I think that was fairly on point, in the sense that you only really hear about the absurdities that go on with, like, Drag Queen Story Hour on the occasional Fox News segment, and then I suppose you have Matt Walsh's documentary that sort of casts a light onto that. But I think that it has sort of died down because, as you said, Todd, if you want a population to mobilize in a possible future war, well, you might need some able-bodied males to carry that out for you. But I'm sure that's not the entire reason, but that could easily be one of the reasons. So, and then I also made an incorrect, I made sort of a correct prediction too, that masks will be phased out, but that was kind of shooting. That was shooting fish in a barrel, because it was already headed that way in the time that we made that prediction in 2021. So, anyways, I think I'll leave my opening comments at that.
Okay, Swithin.
Well, my corona predictions were basically blown out of the water by the Russians. I do think it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened with lockdowns and other general restrictions if that hadn't happened. TP said he predicted more strains. There almost certainly are, and it'd be surprising if they're not, because I seem to remember reading that there was at least 1,000 different variants, like literally over 1,000, like technically, biologically. Of course, you can debate over what it means by having a variant. How much does it need to change to be considered a variant? So there's almost certainly going to be them, but they haven't materialized as a major political issue at all. So I had failed. I failed that. However, and then related thing of that was the vaccine passport issue, which were sort of brought in a bit and then sort of repealed pretty quickly in England after in early 2022. Now, the concern with those still remains. My understanding is that the Canadian government is trying to push ahead and has proposals in the wake to eventually introduce a digital ID system in Canada. And I've even heard some outlets claiming that the Canadians want a digital ID system, apparently. If they're told they want it enough, I suppose they will decide that they want it. Now, whether this would then be used, well, is it strictly a vaccine passport? Not necessarily, or at least not yet. But insofar as all your dealings with the state and what the state is interested in is on a digital platform, then this could clearly be used in a broader basis and used like a vaccine passport would be, because the concern wasn't just that it was, a vaccine passport and somehow vaccines were special. It was more of a case of a way of another excuse to control the population. So whilst I was wrong in certain respects with the vaccine passport, it seems, at least in the context of Canada, that's still a bit of an issue. I predicted more right-wing terrorism. That hasn't happened yet, although, to be fair, it's only been 6 months or so. And interestingly, in England, we've now had some fun violence between the Hindus and the Muslims in Leicester. Because, what happens when you bring people from countries who don't like each other to your country? They fight each other, unsurprisingly. So whether that will garner a backlash amongst sort of the skinheads, if there are any left, which you could Jericho right-wing violence, and whether they might decide to take out some ethnic MP or something. I mean, as a side with that, I mean, all the new Elizabeth Truss's cabinet is basically female or black or brown. It is like the most diverse TM cabinet that they've had. So if you wanted to get some sort of racialist right-wing terrorism, I mean, they've got a lot of targets, put it that way. So that hasn't happened. I also predicted from when I look back at it that we're talking about, I refer to it as Wokistan. It still seems to be going quite heavily here, even if it isn't doing quite as much in America. I suppose I've given up trying to find, well, normal people, what would be considered normal in an advert 20 years ago on an advert today. That simply doesn't happen. Oh, and also ITV cut a joke from the early 2000s Spider-Man film because one of the characters, Peter Parker chides one of the baddies by saying, "Oh yeah, this is your boyfriend," and oh no, you can't do that because that's homophobic and bad, and so it must be cut out. So I still very much think it's alive. Oh, and also interestingly related to that. PayPal has terminated the account of the Free Speech Union in Britain. The Free Speech Union is actually really a pretty milquetoast sort of free speech platform type thing. They don't really defend particularly radical individuals. For instance, they don't defend Julian Assange. Yet PayPal have cut them loose, which now has possibly created many people to leave PayPal. Whether it has or not is another question. So that still seems to be moving in that direction to some extent. One thing I think I was correct in, I did mention I think that health was going to be an increased weapon and an increasingly used weapon for the legitimizing the state. In England this summer, not last year, we're not 2023 yet. We actually had warm weather. Like it was warm. So we had a few days, not many. There was like a combination of like 2 in a row, twice, of temperatures which might have reached 90 or mid 30s. And what I wasn't aware of in 2021, I didn't know this when I predicted it, that the Met Office, who are like a meteorological organization, they have a very good reputation of predicting climate and weather and stuff in England. In collaboration with Public Health England, which is the public health body, particularly pernicious and unpleasant organization, had decided that they were going to issue extreme weather warnings, which I had done historically, but now it's going to be extreme heat. So on these days when normally you go, it's quite nice, we'll go to the beach, it's hot, it's good. This was then doom, and everything was in red, because the way they broadcast it now, anything that's warm is red, like deep red, like a danger. We had extreme weather warnings. It was dangerous. And one of the dangers that Public Health England identified apparently was if it was going to be hot, so you're going to have an increased probability of water-based accidents because people were going to go to the beach. It's like, this is ridiculous. And unbeknownst to me, this was actually created in 2021, but was first issued last year. So previously, if it was hot, it's like, oh, it's hot. Oh, okay, great. Fine. But now it's a deeply serious event and it could harm people. This is just sort of continuing. Something similar, again, with climate, with health and also related to the climate change stuff. Apparently, Schiphol Airport, which was the major airport in the Netherlands, is cutting 20% of its flights. And they say explicitly because it's going to go to meet their climate targets. Apparently, they've been doing this more clandestinely, saying, oh, no, we just got shortage of staff. So more sort of climate-related stuff, which I think I predicted, at least indirectly, because they always tie that to health, has something that is continuing and expanding. So whilst the stuff on coronavirus was wrong, I do think I wasn't entirely wrong.
All right. So yeah, I think it was UTP that said that Russia changed everything. Yeah, as of December of 2021, the defeat in Afghanistan was only 2-3 months old. I think it was in September. The United States pulled out of Kabul, and yeah, Russia just kind of comes out of nowhere. Obviously, it didn't come out of nowhere, but everything was about health and COVID and the supply chains, and it's still about the supply chains. But it's interesting to look at the fact that how quickly things can change. Obviously, these were not predictions that I made in that episode, but 2 other predictions I'd made which have come true, is that with the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan, big things would happen. Other nations would smell blood in the water and make a move. Russia made a move real fast, a lot faster than I thought. Only like 6 months later, they invaded Ukraine. Also, that the global 2019 is never coming back. We're never going back to before 2019, and everything seems to be on track for that as well. Now, the other thing is with war in the offing. Now, here's another thing too, though, right? Given when we were reporting on Ukraine, as leading up in January, February, and beyond, one of the things that was brought up was, America, NATO, and America's insane aggressiveness against Russia, pushing their troops to the border with Ukraine. Now, what we have seen is almost all of NATO's surplus, obsolete military equipment being sold to the Ukrainians for a tidy profit. So I think we can say classically, it's a classic example of war profiteering, where they needed to get rid of this stuff. They also needed to generate a demand to build new military equipment, right? There was, you mentioned TP in an earlier roundtable, that there was going to be a joint Franco-German, armored personnel carrier, tank, artillery platform system that was kind of dead in the water for a while. It's not dead in the water now. And so part of it too is that they wanted to make money. It looks like, Big Pharma made their cut, time to share the loot with the military industrial complex. So I think part of what we're seeing here in this pivot, and something that would have been very difficult to predict in 2021, is that the military industrial complex in both Europe and the United States is going to reassert itself to make record profits. First of all, selling obsolete junk to the Ukrainians at a marked up price, and then also selling them some advanced systems like the HIMARS, as well as our own, rebuilding new systems, new platforms that had been on the books for a very long time but not been acted on. And then as far as Russia, it's hard to predict what Putin would have done as of 2021, because the escalation of NATO had not, it was going on, but the Donbass had been this unstable region for already like 6-7 years. So we were like, this could go on for another 6-7 years. And I think part of the reason why Putin attacked is, as he was saying, that the Ukrainians were gearing up for a far more serious counterattack into the Donbass, which Russia thought had a likelihood of success. So they didn't want that to happen. And then also China making a move with Taiwan. I remember when Hong Kong was given back to China, and there was the Blizzard Blitzchung sort of debacle where Blizzard, pulled his earnings because he offended China because he said free Hong Kong. And a lot of these people said, well, once Hong Kong falls, Taiwan is next. That was like 2020, 2021. And they were right. The people who were in Hong Kong or reporting on Hong Kong said that Taiwan is next. And I wasn't paying as much attention to that back then because, again, COVID loomed so large and the economic crisis was looming so large. But we've seen that as well. And so there were things at the time that were indicating that we could be moving in this direction. It was just that I think COVID was such a big issue for all of us that it was harder to see. Keith Preston.
Well, concerning COVID, I figured that this public health situation involving COVID would linger for a while, but I tended to think it would start to fade the way that it has, solely because of the precedent that was there. Like when COVID started, I started paying a lot of attention to what had happened during the Spanish flu back during the World War I era. And that lasted about as long as COVID. It started in the spring, like late winter, early spring of 1918, and they had several waves of it, and then it started to die down in the spring of 1920. And COVID has pretty much gone in the same direction. Like we had the initial waves, and then we had the lockdowns, and then we had everything associated with it. And then earlier this year, it started to, I wouldn't say fade from view, but it started to become a less significant issue. even if it still lingers. And I think it'll linger for a while. I was in the grocery store today and I saw a young woman wearing a mask who looked to be barely in her 20s. I mean, I can't imagine she's an unhealthy, high risk person. I don't know, maybe she's a leukemia survivor or something. But I find it interesting though that people are still getting, still wearing their masks. Like the other day, I saw someone wearing a face mask, a surgical mask, walking up the sidewalk. I mean, there were no people around. Like this wasn't a busy sidewalk where they're constantly have someone in their face. It was basically them by themselves wearing a surgical mask. I saw someone on a motor scooter with a surgical mask on the other day. Now, I live in an area that's a deep blue area, so a lot of the people around me are very politically correct and got to do their part to protect public health by wearing a mask and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I kind of thought that would start to fade a bit this year. But one thing I wouldn't have expected is I wouldn't have expected the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I knew there were tensions there. And then when that started to heat up, even then I was like, well, I don't know if there's really going to be an invasion. But there was, and I do find it interesting. And now it seems to be escalating. Now the war in Ukraine seems to be escalating. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. And as far as the domestic politics, one thing that's going on is that we didn't really talk about in the predictions episode is everything that's going on with Donald Trump. Like I've thought that some of that has taken a unique turn with the FBI raid on his residence. And yesterday I saw where the Attorney General of New York State has filed a lawsuit where she actually wants to ban the Trumps, like anyone in the Trump family, from leading a corporation in the state of New York, which is where the Trumps are actually based. And it's not just Donald; it's also his kids, and all of that. And then she said that she's going to refer her investigation to the IRS for criminal prosecution for tax evasion or tax fraud and things like that. So it looks like they keep trying to, pile on whatever they can on Trump. I know recently something like 30 or 40 of his associates were subpoenaed, and then Steve Bannon, I think he's been arrested on multiple. Well, I think he's actually been sentenced to jail on some charges, but then he's been arrested on more criminal charges. So the feeling that I get now is that the power elite really is trying to purge the Trump movement by cutting it off at the head. I think they look at it like, this guy and his associates are just more trouble than they're worth, and they're moving to take him down now. Or, at least that's how it seems. They seem to be, if that's not the end game, then they're certainly going to a lot of trouble in the process. So it seems like that's what they're trying to do. Another thing too is increasingly it looks like Biden is not going to be running for re-election. I always thought that probably would be the case because the guy can barely function as it is. But increasingly I'm seeing where they're trying to trot out new potential figureheads that can replace him. Like yesterday I saw where Gavin Newsom is now being floated as a potential presidential candidate to replace Biden. I mean, this was a guy in his own state where he's the governor. They had a recall election. Now, he beat the recall. He did beat recall. But the very fact that they had one shows that the guy's not that popular. And California is one of the bluest states in the United States as well. And then I know they've been trying to float Pete Buttigieg as a replacement for Biden, but he just doesn't get the numbers in the polls. I think they kind of want him because he's a McKinsey guy, which is connected to the deep state, the intelligence services, and all of that. But I think they're concerned that he's not marketable enough. I mean, a lot of Americans aren't going to vote for an openly gay guy who's married to a man and has the word "bud" in his name. I mean, it's just unlikely to. That's just a no sell among a lot of population groups. So I'll put it that way. So it looks like that's going on, and Taiwan too. It looks like that there's increased saber rattling over Taiwan. Although I think that. Russia's eclipsed that, and then Iran. It's also the question of what's going to happen with Iran, because that's put the United States in an interesting position. The United States is now in a position where, okay, if we have an energy crisis, we have high fuel costs, we have complaints about inflation. So now they're in a position of trying to actually purchase oil from countries they otherwise have sanctions against, Iran and Venezuela and some others. So some of the things we talked about have unfolded, but not really in the way that we necessarily thought they would have happened. But we were on the right track, I think, as far as a lot of these issues. But there's always
yeah, we were over the target. You're right. Yeah. So Terminal.
Right. Well, I'm in full agreement that Ukraine surprised all of us in spite of the violence in Donetsk for 5 or 6 years beforehand. Yet for me, the most interesting item on the list to speculate and to apply some predictions towards is the war in Ukraine, and with that, the sort of slow and complicated return to a multipolar world. Much of my historical reading has been involved with just military history. And in the case of Ukraine, there's a lot of information and propaganda to sort of disentangle. And for the average person, I think, this is the variable that makes following the events in Ukraine so unnavigable, which is this variety of information and polar opposite narratives that are available to the public. And I think it's fair to assume that most of the viewers here likely watch a variety of news sources and YouTube channels that cover the war. And when you watch, say, for example, Jimmy Dore, Jackson Hinkle, Haas, and others, you get the sense that Ukraine is on its last legs. And then when you attempt to stomach Western media, it would appear that Russia is on the brink of annihilation. So consuming information on both sides feels like you're sort of experiencing the onset of psychosis. One important detail that has recently emerged is a study commissioned in 2019 by the RAND Corporation, which is a study entitled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. And this study basically details how Russia could be economically crippled by multilateral sanctions, and to view Ukraine as basically a war zone to grind down Russian forces and to remove Russia from the world stage, or at least regulate them to a limited sort of regional power. That study also discusses the possible repercussions of pressuring Russia into a nuclear arms race to further exacerbate its economic strains. So this is all quite telling. And now, of course, this is just a publication from a single think tank, but it has sort of really similar vibes to that of when General Wesley Clark publicly revealed that U.S. foreign policy wished to invade multiple countries in the Middle East. So I won't say outright that the study was used as a blueprint for the current situation, but the resemblance sure doesn't look good. For myself, I'm personally persuaded that the Russians will end up forcing the Ukrainians into some sort of peace talks through a series of military defeats and basically having their industries and their critical infrastructure being heavily damaged. I find it difficult to believe that the EU or NATO would allow for the situation to devolve into a likely nuclear exchange if too many suspicious or high value military assets find their way into Ukraine. A good example of this would be the German Leopard 2 tank, or say that the British send Challengers or something like that, or perhaps even more juicy and expensive pieces of hardware. What the cost will be for Russia ultimately in the end is not clear to me at the moment, but I do find it absolutely absurd that the Russians have allegedly lost 60 to 80,000 troops, and this is according to articles from the Pentagon. And honestly, their track record on transparency in the 20th and 21st centuries is honestly just abysmal. In terms of the ground war, I think one important comparison to consider is that the Russians boast a 10-to-1 artillery advantage over the Ukrainians. Now, in the 2020s, the term artillery can be a bit vague to the layperson, but artillery can mean towed artillery cannons, self-propelled guns, assault guns, and different rocket delivery systems. And so all of these can be in indirect or direct fire. And also the geography of Ukraine plays into Russia's doctrine very well, since they are now a highly mobile and firepower-oriented army. And just a few other thoughts on Ukraine. I think that it goes without saying that the borders of Ukraine were horribly drawn up, and that they don't reflect at all any sort of ethnic divisions or languages. I think much of eastern Ukraine is culturally Russian, and this has created some really dismal circumstances for eastern Ukrainians who often face reprisal from Ukrainian forces when the Russians are driven out of certain villages. I think the persistence of NATO to sort of seemingly bleed Ukraine dry will strain several member states of NATO, and specifically of which I'm talking about Germany and Poland. I will say that from sort of a geostrategic perspective, Todd, you and I streamed a video about 2 years ago about the geostrategy of Germany. And what we both agreed on is that Germany basically needs a buffer between themselves and Russia. So if Ukraine is ultimately bludgeoned down to sort of a landlocked nation with the Russians on the eastern banks of the Dnieper, that will force basically large military spending on the part of Germany and Poland. And I don't think that that's something that they haven't been used to, honestly, since World War II. Likely, this is just more spending than they'd prefer, and Germany and Poland basically have to take the helm of a broader so-called European defense because, let's face it, Romania and the Baltic states are just not up to the task of taking on Russia in some sort of prolonged contingency. And and just a quick point on Germany too. I think, and this is something that again we discussed in our German video on geostrategy, but the defense paper was leaked from within the Bundeswehr entitled Strategic Perspective 2040, and that basically details how Germany would react in the event that the EU dissolves. So the reason I mention this is because Germany and plenty of other European nations have plans in place for what I personally believe will be the termination of the EU sometime. It won't be next year, but perhaps in the next 4 to 6 years. Overall, I think in terms of the population differential, the artillery, armor, and overall military hardware advantage, Russia is simply favored to win. And there's been plenty of incompetency on the part of the Russians, but even with the sort of new NATO-style orientation of the Ukrainian military, they won't be able to turn the tide. If anything, I think it would be in Ukraine's best interest to negotiate now in order to avoid becoming either a landlocked nation and to retain as much territory as possible. If they gamble too big and eat away at too much time, they could risk losing more land. And they could likely keep some of that land now if they agree to a negotiated settlement. And I think I'll just leave my comments at that. The last thing I'll say too is that there's been no, and this is just purely on a military hardware side of things, but there's been no sightings and no reports of the T-14 Russian main battle tank as far as I could find. It's just not it's still considered an untested platform and hasn't been spotted in any theaters of war. But I do think that Russia will simply be forcing Ukraine to the table within 1 to 2 years from now.
Yeah, the one thing I also want to add to TP is that when we did our geopolitics stream on Mackinder, we talked about, well, if we were going to steelman the idea of the world island, how would it form? And well, we predicted that it would be China in alliance with Russia and some other nations, and it looks like that's what Z is exactly trying to do. Swithin.
Just on Ukraine, the narratives of who's winning and who's not are baffling and very difficult to tell what is actually going on. Although it does seem to be the case that the Ukrainians aren't doing too well, because I believe they're now drafting women over the age of 17. So shame they didn't get out when they could. So that doesn't sound like a move of a country that is doing relatively well. My also understanding is that the Ukrainians were going to negotiate with the Russians very early. But the Americans told them basically, don't do it, and we'll give you lots of nice equipment, and you can beat the Russians. So that apparently happened pretty early. So Yes, that would seem to be a way of selling weapons and other extra stuff. With respect to Germany, I actually think is interesting. In the EU context, they've been trying to get a European army off the ground since at least 2001 with the Nice Treaty. They didn't call it an army because that wouldn't be very popular in the nation state, the member state countries. No, it would be a rapid reaction force. And they've been trying to do this for a long time now. From what I can tell about European militaries, though, the only one that's basically any good, apart from the British military, is the French. And if anything was going to happen, the Germans has got better than it have been historically. Well, it was pretty good historically. I mean, after the war, they'd have to get in and play ball with it. The rest of the countries, they're really going to be putting that much money into it. I don't know, but I think the Germans might try to. The EU has tension now because of the UK left, and also they've sanctioned Hungary, which I believe is the first time they've sanctioned any member state, because it's no longer a proper democracy. What constitutes a proper democracy, I have no idea.
Real quick, Swithin, they're mad because he's buying gas from Russia. Because he didn't join the sanctions completely.
Oh, because that's actually an undemocratic thing to do. Because what you should do is buy it from the Indians who bought it from the Russians, because that's okay. Because we're giving money to India as a sort of like reparations for empire or something. So there are internal divisions in the EU. That's not true. I also heard recently as well that Macron was floating the idea of like a new European organization. Now, I don't know if this was sort of like a potential replacement for the EU, and they were trying to get Britain to join. And it was kind of like, oh no, we can part of this European club. So this is quite interesting, especially with the power play with obviously France and Germany, who are now the only two reasonably large powers within the EU of any particular influence. But as Manon has pointed out, and that's what I was going to raise as well, Germany, if it becomes sort of a military engagement, well, they don't really have very much energy to use. They're closing all their nuclear power stations. They cut off the Nord Stream gas pipeline. They're relying on the wind blowing and the sun shining. Otherwise, they don't really have very much to use. Now, obviously, of course, you've got to use things, not just electricity. You've got to use like oil and other things to sort of get the machine power to produce things. But they are not a place that you want to do a lot of heavy industry building at present, given the way their energy policy is going. As an aside, one of the reasons why, now, we've mentioned this in the past, I think we discussed the green energy a number of months ago, but the whole, oh no, the gas price is going up. The gas, as in natural gas price, has been going up since February 2021. And that was for multiple list of reasons. It was cold in Europe and they used it for heating, etc. But one of the reasons why it kept going up in the summer was because it wasn't windy enough. Coal is basically illegal. I was quite privileged. I went past very recently one of Britain's only remaining coal power stations. When I saw it, I thought civilization has taken place. And interestingly, because of the energy situation, they've actually paid the owner not to decommission it yet, because basically they said you have to decommission it because of all the CO2 targets and stuff. But it wasn't windy enough. And the problem is, the only form of electricity generation that you can easily turn on an increase and decrease output easily is natural gas and coal. But you can't use coal. So you just have this massive scramble for gas. So unsurprisingly, price go through the roof. And that was before the Ukraine war, lest any politician wants to blame it entirely on Putin bad. Yeah, I'm skeptical to what extent Germany would be of any reasonable fighting force, given it literally lights might just go out. I mean, that is just entirely possible. They don't need the bouncing bomb this time to make the lights go out.
Yeah, Europe's not in a good way. So we'll start with final statements. We'll begin with you, Keith.
One thing that I mentioned in my original predictions that I haven't really talked about was inflation. I mentioned that inflation could get worse, and that could be a source of political conflict, and that's happened. Inflation has gotten worse this year, and it's become a primary issue in U.S. politics. Like I saw a poll recently that asked people what their top five issues were in the election that's coming up, the midterms, and two of them were what you think of Donald Trump and what you think of Joe Biden, just the popularity or unpopularity of those two individuals. But then the other three, when it came to actual substantive issues, were inflation, abortion, and immigration. Those seem to be the issues that people are the most concerned about. As a general rule, when you look at clusters of issues, you see people are more concerned about the economy in the United States than anything else. And now we're starting to see a repeat of what happened in the late 70s. In the late 70s, we had runaway inflation, and the Federal Reserve stepped in and started raising interest rates. And back then, they actually raised interest rates all the way up to 20%, and that created a recession. And in the early 80s, we had a bad recession. The Republicans got slaughtered in the 1982 midterm elections because of the recession. But now we're actually starting to see the Fed starting to jack up interest rates again. It's going to be interesting to see what the economic impact of that is. Like if we switch from a situation where inflation is less of an issue to where, say, unemployment or recession becomes more of an issue, that could actually work against the Biden administration. Interestingly, the Biden administration seems to have been trying, and the Democrats in recent times, the last month or two, it seems like they've been trying to give the appearance of becoming more competent. Like they've tried to enact more legislation. They had whether you approve of all this or not, they had the CHIPS Act, they had the Inflation Reduction Act. So it looks like they're getting things done. They've gotten better at making it look like they can actually do stuff. And then there's the student loan debt forgiveness thing. I think that has actually improved the standings of the Democrats politically. But the inflation thing is one of the primary issues everybody's worried about nowadays, particularly fuel costs. And now inflation's starting to come down a little bit, but it's still not back to where it was before. But there's also the possibility that recession could be around the corner. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if that's the case.
Well, Keith, they just redefined recession.
Yeah, well, they redefine inflation. I mean, they redefine everything. They redefine pandemic. One person is sick, pandemic.
Yeah, they've also redefined certain biological categories as well.
Well, yeah, that's interesting how they just redefine language to make it mean whatever they want when it's convenient about anything.
Yeah. About anything. Yeah, terminal philosophy. Final thoughts.
Right. Well, yeah, I can't say that, I disagree with anything that's been said. I believe that simply that Ukraine and its outcome is just, it's taken the spotlight away from COVID, obviously. I mean, there were some memes that were going around that were basically thanking Putin for single-handedly curing COVID. So I guess we have to give credit to where credit's due. But it's hard to say. I think Keith made a good point in regard to these midterms that are coming up. I think the Democrats are trying to improve their image and just their optics in general before the midterms happen, because the predictions for the midterms for the Democrats have not been good. One interesting point about the slight decrease in the price of gas in the United States is that much of that is attributed to the Biden administration tapping into what had basically been categorized as stockpiles that haven't necessarily been purchased from foreign countries, or that haven't been tapped here at home. It's just that they were in basically industrial stockpiles, and it was something like, I think it was like 10 million barrels or something. It was a pretty large quantity, but or it could have been a lot more than that. I apologize, I don't have the quantity off the top of my head, but that is part of the reason why. And I think Jackson Hinkle, to his credit, did some good reporting on that. So there's probably some better references there available for you on one of his recent streams. But Yeah, I guess we'll just have to see what happens with Ukraine. My just one light prediction about Ukraine is that I honestly believe from 1 to 2 years from now, I think that Ukraine will have no choice but to agree to a negotiated settlement, because if they don't, I mean, what do they want to have? They want to be landlocked and have everything west of the Dnieper. I mean, that's you lose access to the Black Sea and all sorts of shipping lanes. That would just be a disaster. So, anyways, I'll leave my closing thoughts at that.
Okay, Swithin.
With respect to the economics, I think the economic issues are going to become more apparent and become more in the forefront of people's minds. Even if there's not technically a recession, the real incomes, purchasing power of households is going down. I mean, how can it not? I mean, who's getting a 10% pay rise this year? Maybe Hunter Biden is, but apart from him, I mean, who is? So even if there's not technically a recession, the fact that real wages are going down significantly is going to be something that's going to be concerned. Now, obviously, of course, people are going to be more concerned if they lose their job, which is what you would expect in a typical sort of recessionary position. So I do think that's going to be there. And also, yes, the Bank of England, I think it was yesterday or last week, increased the interest rates to a massive 2.25%. Which by historical standards, we've just got above the previous all-time low, which was 2% in 1933. So they're not really going at it as hard in the same way as they did in the 70s and the early 80s. Last time in the 80s, when they had the inflation at a similar rate as it did today, it was about 10%. We haven't got there yet, and I don't think they have the stomach for doing so, just because how much more debt the society generally has. Whether that be a good thing is another question, but I simply don't think they'll do it. But the economic issues will come to the fore, and it's going to be interesting to see how. Now, I've said about health and climate change, TM stuff, is how they're going to be able to navigate the issue that basically this is going to be an attack on the poor because they're not going to be able to afford stuff, but you can, and that's going to become ever more apparent. And it'd be interesting to see whether they can navigate that, because I think that'll become increasingly difficult.
All right. Thank you, Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, and Swithin Dobson. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.